Okay, so good evening, everyone. I want to welcome everyone to another JPN Share podcast episode tonight in conjunction with the Einstein Synagogue. We'll be hearing from Rabbi Kaminetzky, the Rabbi of the Einstein Synagogue, on the topic of navigating Shabbos in the hospital. And we want to thank him graciously for agreeing to share his time with us. And I mentioned this before, but again, for anyone interested, they want to discuss this more. There is a chat link for a Shabbos halacha chat in the hospital that is pretty robust and discusses a lot of the issues that come out. So if anyone's interested, feel free to reach me afterwards or join or find the link in the chat. Here, by Kaminetzky, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Sorry for the late start time. Something came up, Bezos Hashem, in this series when we set a time. We're gonna start on time. I know how valuable everyone's time is here, and I deeply apologize for that. But so we're just gonna start. Maybe we'll don't worry, we won't keep it too long. Maybe we'll just do some of the stuff in the next part. But what I wanted to do in this series in general is to outline some of the issues, some of the challenges, some of the things that are going to come up for aspiring physicians, current physicians. Obviously, I'm in front of a number of people from the Einstein Shul here, who I know personally, but I'm very happy to have this broadcast to as many physicians as it would help. And I wanted to make a few disclaimers, however, before we officially begin. First and foremost, what I definitely want to start with is that every single person here who's an aspiring physician, or every single person who is currently a physician, is involved in a tremendous mitzvah of saving lives. The One of the highest values that we have, the mitzvah of saving lives, as we're going to get to in a minute, is absolutely axiomatic in halacha and in Judaism, and it's a holy, holy endeavor. And in no way is that endeavor minimized by the questions we're going to tackle in this year. The fact that we're going to struggle with different questions of what to do in this circumstance in the hospital, that you can't do this, you might have to stay in the hospital in X situation, or you'd be able to do, or you wouldn't be able to do other things, in no way minimizes the incredible, incredible mitzvah of what you're all involved in, which is the mitzvah of pikuach nefesh. If, for example, the Einstein spouses, I know there's some spouses here. If the Einstein spouses asked me to give a shir series for Shabbos observance in their respective professions, computer science or law or investment banking, it would be an extremely short shir. The answer is everything's usher. There's no discussion. There's no discussion to be had, but only because of the inherent value of what everyone here is involved in, everyone on the Zoom is involved in, only because of that, and the worth of the profession that you're entering into or already in, for some of the people on the Zoom, is this even a discussion? And what we should know at the outset, we're going to get into some of these issues of Hutra and Dechuya and how we're supposed to go about it halachically, but halacha expects us to save lives and keep Shabbos. And that's something that we're going to be focusing on. And I think, just as a word of I guess, perhaps Eitzah, perhaps the recommendation, maybe the best way of showing how important this is and how important both of these values are, is that when you're not in the hospital, when there's a Shabbos where you're off, there's a Shabbos where you're able to be home. If you're someone who never got dressed really on a Friday night, then get dressed up for Shabbos on a Friday night. If you didn't previously, if perhaps you weren't so makbid on Shal Shuddis, for example, maybe have Shal Shuddis, because those Shabbosos where you're off, those Shabbosos where you're not in the hospital, where you're not directly engaged in any way in Pikuach Nefesh, those Shabbosos are the time to perhaps keep Shabbos in the normally understood manner to its fullest extent, with kavod and oneg Shabbos, and the pleasure of Shabbos, and perhaps that'll reinforce the point that when you are in the hospital, when you are involved in this holy mitzvah of saving lives and taking care of people, then you're there for the mitzvah of pikuach nefesh. You're not there simply because it's a profession. You're there because you're involved in the holy mitzvah, and I think that's an important point. So obviously, it's not because we're taking Shabbos lightly, and that's what that would show. It's not because we're taking Shabbos lightly that anyone would find themselves in a hospital on Shabbos. On the contrary, we take it very seriously, and it's foundational. And we're never downgrading Shabbos, but we're just highlighting life in some aspects. Also another disclaimer. So that's another point I wanted to make. Another disclaimer. that I wanted to make at the beginning of this series is that the discussion, which is certainly a discussion about whether you should be, can be, are allowed to be in a non-Shomer Shabbos residency, is a totally separate discussion that everyone could and should have with their respective Rav, their local Rav. I've had a number of conversations here with members of our community. This series is not dealing with that question whatsoever. It's assuming you're already going to the hospital, whether you're going to even a Shomer Shabbos residency, perhaps for your fellowship, when you're attending, at some point you might find yourself in a hospital, and that's what this is addressing, the question, which is an important one to ask of going into residency, wherever it is. That's a separate discussion that we're not going to be hitting on in this series. Another important disclaimer, sorry for the disclaimers, but I think they're all essential, is that we're going to talk about a lot of different situations here. By definition, to talk about medical halacha, we need to get into certain situations. And there are a lot of factors that go into each situation. There are a lot of factors that would, as you all know, that would go into any particular situation, both la halacha and in the metzias, in the practical medical factors. And what's essential, just like a diagnosis, that there are no exact two cases that are the same, and you should speak to a competent Rav before assuming that X is similar to Y, and for sure, non-medical professionals also need a rabbi to ask questions to, but aspiring physicians and current physicians would certainly need a rabbi more than most, because there's just so many things to discuss and to think about, and it's an opportunity to learn halacha in a very real way. And you should find a Rav who knows you, who knows halacha, and who knows the metzias, and who attempts to get a grasp on the unique facts on the ground for medical professionals. Perhaps we're not getting into this today, but perhaps when we discuss traveling on Shabbos and you discuss with a Rav, obviously I'm available to those in the Einstein community, those outside. I'm sure I could be made available, but ideally everyone should find a Rav in their local community or someone who knows them. When you're talking about, for example, traveling on Shabbos, the Rav should be aware that something called Uber exists, and if not, then that's a problem. So these are important disclaimers, and again, underlying all of these discussions that we're going to have is the absolutely essential idea that everything that you're involved in, everything that you're doing in a hospital, and everything that this profession is about is underlying this holy idea of kol makayim nefesh achas ki lukayim olam maleh, one who saves just one life, one who is able to fix just one person, one who's able to help one person in this tremendous way. It's as if they're saving the entire world, and we should understand that before we enter into any of these discussions. And Be'ezus Hashem, in our learning together, we should be zocha to be able to recommit to the supreme value of life, as well as the importance of Shabbos Kodesh. So to get going, and again, we're not going to go too long, and maybe we'll just start together here. I don't plan that this series is going to be so many parts. We discussed maybe 5 or 6 parts, and we're going to get to many important things. Don't worry, a lot of the things that we're going to do are going to be extremely halacha l'maisa. Today, instead of just jumping into it, riding on Shabbos, things like that, I wanted to present some of the background to Pikuach Nefesh on Shabbos, some of the important principles that we're working with, because they're essential and things we're going to come back to. The game plan is to basically just outline 3 different things. We'll see. We might just skip a little bit around and only do some briefly. But first and foremost, the source and scope of Pikuach Nefesh on Shabbos, and then second, to talk about the concept of Hutra and Dechuya, and then third, the different levels of sickness, the 4 levels of sickness that have different parameters, what you can and can't do in those situations of sickness. So let's just start. The first source, Minayin l'roas chaver shu toveh b'nar. How do I know that someone who's drowning in a river, or is being dragged by a wild animal, or is being attacked by bandits, that one is chayiv to save them? Talmud lomar lo samad al dam re'echa. The pasuk tells us lo samad al dam re'echa, don't stand idly by while someone is in danger, while someone's life is in danger. This is the source of saving lives. This is the source that we're all involved in. We're not at Shabbos yet, but this is the source that we have. And the Gemara gets to a different source as well, just going straight to the bold. The Gemara quotes another source, Avedas Gufo Minayin, Talmud Lomer V'Hashivos Solo. The Gemara quotes another source, one being Lo Saman Al Damreacha, the other one being the concept of Hashavas Aveda, of returning a lost object. And if you look at that pasuk, and Rashi on that Gemara points it out, Vashivos Solo, the Torah, when it already described returning someone's lost object, then it adds two words seemingly superfluously, Vashivos Solo. And if you look at those words, it seems to say you return him to himself. So what does that mean? You return his life to him. You have to save him. Just like you return his object to him, you have to return him to him. You have to save him. And those two sources are absolutely essential, both of them. We know to save someone from Lo Saman Al Damrecha, but the Nishmas Avram, in fact, Dr. Abraham, part of the goal of this series, I guess, is to introduce us to some medical halacha svarim. Nishmas Avram is an important one. Dr. Abraham was a doctor in Shari Tzedek for many, many years. I think he recently retired, and he was able to ask all of the many of the Gedolei Poskim of the last century, many important halachic topics. If you look at the Sefer Nishmas Avram, they have it in both Hebrew and English. They have an ArtScroll version that all of it goes in order of Shulchan Aruch, and all of the medically relevant things are right on the bottom there, and it's highly recommended. So the Nishmas Avram, and that's really why I'm quoting him as well. But he makes an important point based on the in Yoredeya, Siman Shin Lamed Vav Siv Dalid. He expands this last pasuk of Ashivos Solo, and referring to Avedas Mamono, referring to someone's lost money and someone's lost physical things, and someone who lost something, based on the Rambam Perush HaMishnayos in Nedarim. The Rambam points out that just like you have a chiyuv to prevent monetary loss for your friends, so too you have a chiyuv to prevent even someone from getting sick. So one might think that the mitzvah that everyone's involved in is just to save someone who's already in danger, just to save someone's life. And if you're perhaps preventing illness, or you're preventing someone who's currently healthy from getting sick, maybe that won't be a mitzvah. But the Nishmas Avram is medayik from the Rambam. I'll read the Rambam to you. Chiyav harofim in Torah l'rapos. This is the Rambam in Nedarim, in Perush HaMishnayos in Nedarim. Chiyav harofim in Torah l'rapos. I just have it on my sheet. I didn't put it on the sheet. Chiyav harofim in Torah l'rapos choli Yisrael. It's a chiyuv from the Torah that a doctor will heal choli Yisrael. V'zanichlal b'pasuk b'machakasav b'pasuk hashivos solo, and it's included in this pasuk hashivos solo of returning him to himself. L'rapos es gufo shuhu kisharoa so mesukan v'yochel hatzilo, that you should save someone when you are able to. When you have the ability to, o begufo, says the Rambam, either physically, o b'mamono, or with your money or resources, o b'chachmaso, or with your wisdom, and that's the pshat in the Rambam. And the Nishmas Avram expands, v'nirali. It appears to me, says the Nishmas Avram, shemikan raya brura. This is a clear raya. This is a clear proof. Sheish mitzvah v'chovim min Torah lo rak l'rapos sachole, not only to heal one who is sick, elagam l'tapel b'habari, o kedei limnoa mimenu machla unezak ufani, also to be involved in someone who is currently well, but in order to prevent illness or physical harm. And this is an important mitzvah that we're all involved in, like that everyone here is involved in, like I mentioned before. And again, just like you have to prevent someone from losing their money, so too you have to prevent them from losing themselves and losing their life. And we get that from the other pasuk Hashivos Solo. So we have two Mar Makomos of the chiyuv to save someone, Lo Saman Al Damreacha, and also Hashivos Solo, you should return someone to themselves. So now comes Shabbos. So obviously it's a big deal to save someone, as we started off with in some of our disclaimers as well. So what happens when that runs in contrast to Shabbos? Like I mentioned, in general, any other profession, when it runs in contrast to Shabbos, the answer is tough luck. Any of the Einstein spouses who are in computer science, I would say thank you for supporting your spouse for the next 3 to 35 years. And that's a beautiful thing, and something that we would say shkoyacham, but there's no discussion to be had. But when it comes to Shabbos and Pikuach Nefesh, it's a different story. And this comes from the Gemara in Yuma, the second source on the page. I've mentioned to people in Einstein, but it's important. I don't number my sources in general on purpose for two reasons. One is that the first thing everyone does when they get a source sheet is to look how many sources there are, so you can't do that. And two is because it's not really source number two. It's a Gemara, and just like source number four here is a Be'er Halacha, which is the Chavetz Chaim, which is not the same as a Gemara. I like not numbering my sources, but I'll be clear about what I'm reading. So the second source on the page, which is the Gemara in Yuma Pehei Amud Aleph, says, Minayin lepikuach nefesh shedochas Shabbos. The Gemara says, where do we know? What is the source that pikuach nefesh is dochas Shabbos? It seems the Gemara seems to assume right off the bat that it is dochas Shabbos, which we're not going to get into that havamina, but the Gemara assumes we must have a source that pikuach nefesh, that saving a life, is dochas Shabbos. So where do we get that source? And the Gemara goes through a number of sources, a number of potential sources, which we're not going to fully get into. One is Baba Machteres, the concept of if someone is sneaking into your house and you're able to kill them, so Kal V'chomer for Pikuach Nefesh, that it would be Docha Shabbos. That of course, if you're able to kill someone in order to save a life, so Kal V'chomer, you're able to be Docha Shabbos to save a life. And then there are a number of others that come from other psukim about someone on the Mizbeach who's working, which we're not going to get into. And then the Gemara will just stick to the bold quotes Reb Shimon ben Manasseh. The Gemara said, Reb Shimon ben Manasseh Omer, V'shamru b'nei Yisrael as Shabbos. Where does this source, Pikuach Nefesh being Docha Shabbos, come from? V'shamru b'nei Yisrael as Shabbos. That b'nei Yisrael kept the Shabbos. Amra Torah, based on this pasuk, we could say, Chalal love Shabbos achas. You could be Mechala one Shabbos, Kadesh Yishmor Shabbos harbe, in order to preserve future Shabbos. So you save this life in order to preserve future Shabbos. Where do you get that from the pasuk? If you read, we say this in Kiddush every single Shabbos. Shabbos, you read the rest of the pasuk. What's the rest of the pasuk? La'asos es Shabbos. The goal of V'shamru B'nei Yisrael Shabbos, that B'nei Yisrael kept Shabbos, is La'asos es Shabbos, to make Shabbos in the future. So the goal is not just to be Shomer this Shabbos, but it's La'asos es Shabbos in the future, to be able to make a Shabbos in the future, to be able to keep and preserve Shabbos in the future. So this is one source that the Gemara quotes to in order to violate this Shabbos. We save this life, so maybe you're being Mechal this Shabbos, but now this life that you just saved could keep an indefinite amount of Shabbosos afterwards, and that's one source. But there's another source quoted from Shmuel, Amr Yehuda Amr Shmuel, V'chai Bahem. This other source is V'chai Bahem, and you should live by them. This pasuk is referring to keeping the mitzvos, and then in the end of that pasuk it says you should keep all the mitzvos V'chai Bahem, and live with them, live with the mitzvos. The goal of the mitzvos is not that you should die for them, barring the three cardinal sins of murder, avodah zarah, and idolatry, and incest. But barring the three cardinal sins, which we're not getting into, v'chai bahem, the goal of mitzvos is to live with them, live through them, v'lo shiyamas bahem, and it's not to die for the mitzvos, and Shabbos is included in that. So that's why pikuach nefesh is docha Shabbos. So it seems we have two mar makomos, and although, but there's a big nafkamina between these two mar makomos. What's the practical difference between these two mar makomos? First of all, in the first one, v'shamar b'nei Yisrael Shabbos, what about someone? And this comes up again. We're not going to get too deep into this issue. What about someone who may not be keeping a future Shabbos, someone who may not be observant, or someone who doesn't have the ability to keep Shabbos, perhaps a shoteh who can't keep Shabbos? What about someone like that? So there's a big nafkamina there, obviously, but halakha l'maisa, we would say, first of all, and this is what's definitely important to know, that although both Mar Makomos are quoted, although this other source of Shomer B'nei Yisrael Shabbos is still quoted in future Mar Makomos and in other places in the Gemara, as well as in which I'm going to get to in a minute. Nevertheless, it seems that V'chai Behem is the Iker source. But it seems that V'chai Behem is the Iker source. So, and the Be'er Halacha points this out. But before that, I'll just show that this concept of V'shamru B'nei Yisrael, although V'chai Behem is the number one source, and we'll get there, that's the source that the Rambam relies on, that Pikuach Nefesh is Docha Shabbos. Nevertheless, this concept of being Mechal Shabbos in order to preserve future Shabbosos does come up in a number of places. First of all, that I didn't put on the sheet, the Gemara. Sorry, we'll start with the one that I did put on the sheet. The Gemara in Shabbos, we'll just start from the bold. Tino ben Yomo, the third source. Tino ben Yomo chai mechal anavas Shabbos. You could be mechal Shabbos for a one-day-old baby. Amra Torah, a one-day-old baby who obviously it seems has a future. Amar Torah chalal of Shabbos achas kidei sheyishmor Shabbosos harbe. And the Gemara quotes this same svara of Vishamar Bnei Shabbos, seemingly this source is still alive in Chazal. Although the easy way of understanding this is that this is just in contrast to the previous line in the Gemara, that as opposed to a dead body who obviously doesn't have future Shabbosos to keep, this does, so perhaps it's just to be used as a contrast, but nevertheless, this other source of Rishamar Bnei Shabbos is still used in Chazal. In two other places in Halacha, though it's also quoted. For a good enough community the other way, the Ramban in Torah Sa'adam, which is an important sefer to know as well, the Ramban, who really all of his works are absolutely essential. His works on Chumash, his works on Machshava, his works on Shas. So the Ramban Torah Sa'adam is basically a medical halakha sefer, and he quotes in that sefer the Bahag, which allows us to violate Shabbos for a fetus. A fetus might not technically be alive according to halacha, so v'chai behem wouldn't necessarily apply to a fetus. But nevertheless, let's assume some people understand that it's not a great raya because a fetus that's in danger necessarily puts the mother in danger. But if you could separate that in theory, the Ramban in Torah Sa'adam already quotes Tepahag, who says even though technically it's not alive and v'chai behem doesn't exist there, because this fetus will be able to keep Shabbosos harbe in the future. Therefore, this source is still alive. The Magen Avram quotes this as well. In another case, that if a woman was kidnapped, we would be able to violate Shabbos to get her to keep, and it was in a situation where she wouldn't be able to keep Shabbos ever again. We'd be able to violate Shabbos to get her to keep Shabbos for the rest of her life, which she would not do so otherwise. So both of these sources are used later on, but nevertheless, the Be'er Halacha points out in the fourth source that, and he asked these questions that we mentioned earlier. What about someone who might not have the ability to keep another Shabbos? Again, someone who might not be preserving Shabbos, or someone who might not last till the next Shabbos. We're not sure that he's going to last till the next Shabbos, so we'll just stick to the bold. Amnam be'emes nira, says the Be'er Halacha, which is the Chavetz Chaim, which is the Mishnah Brura. Amnam be'emes nira, the kol zehu l'taima ba'alma, avaladina. All this stuff is just giving reasons for the actual din. Avaladina lo tali klal b'mitzvos. The idea of saving life so that the person could keep mitzvos and keep Shabbos in the future. It's not actually taller on that. The reason is not so that we're docha just one mitzvah in order to keep more mitzvos. We are docha all the mitzvos in order to save Jewish life. Full stop. We save lives. And this seems to be what the Rambam holds of, which is the next source. Says the Rambam, Parak Beis Halacha Gimel in Hilchos Shabbos, v'asr lis mameh b'chol Shabbos, a chole sheish bo sakana, a chole who is in danger, a chole, one who is sick, who is in danger, whose life is on the line. It's usr to wait. We must be swift in treating them. Shenemar asher yasa osa adam v'chai behem v'lo sheyamas behem. We live by the mitzvos and we don't die by the mitzvos, and therefore that is why we are Mechal Shabbos for Pikuach Nefesh. Good. Good. And one other point that does come up that we're not going to get too much into is that it does seem to be agreed upon, according to the Rishonim and the poskim, that both of these sources, V'chai Behem and obviously Vishamar Bnei Shabbos, apply to Jewish people, but nevertheless, we say to save non-Jews as well. All these, this din of being Mechal Shabbos in order to save lives, does extend to non-Jews. There are different reasons behind it that are presented, some more fundamental, some more practical, based on Eva or other reasons, or Pikuach Nefesh for Jews, perhaps. But it's absolutely agreed upon, according to everyone. Rav Moshe writes unequivocally that we could violate even the Oraisis for a non-Jew, and Rosh Zalman and Rabbi Yashiv, quoted in Nishmas Avram, Simin Shin Lamed Sif Beis, he quotes all the modern day poskim, many of the modern day poskim who all say that we would lahalakha violate Shabbos in order to save also non-Jewish lives. Again, for reasons that are beyond the scope of what we're going to deal with right now, but this applies to everyone who you might find in a hospital. Good. So that is the source of Pikuach Nefesh being Docha Shabbos. So now what I want to do that's important is that this seems to be, people knew, even if you didn't know the source, that Pikuach Nefesh is Docha Shabbos. Otherwise you wouldn't be here, or surprise, Pikuach Nefesh is Docha Shabbos. But what's important is that once we hear this source of Achai Behem, what might you think? One might think this applies to, well, first of all, before we get to that, this also, now that we're here, we're skipping around a little bit, but Pikuach Nefesh doesn't just involve someone who's actually drowning and you could tell they're there right now. It also includes the concept of Safei Pikuach Nefesh. It also includes someone who you're not 100% sure, but you're under the impression that they might be in a case of Pikuach Nefesh. This is essential to understand for everyone, because a lot of times until you have, and a lot of times, let's assume you're talking to normal people who aren't medical professionals, and someone has a terrible fall down the stairs, and it's possible they have a brain hemorrhage. You're not sure, right? I'm a regular person. I don't know anything about medicine. What do? So the answer is, you don't even ask. The answer is, if it's a Safei Pikuach Nefesh, if it's a Safei case, where someone's life might be in danger, then you violate Shabbos. And this comes from the Shulchan Aruch and really the Mishnah Berurah. I'm not going to give so much background to the Shulchan Aruch because it's important to just quote this Mishnah Berurah. The Shulchan Aruch in the next source is Maka she'ena shel chalal, a wound that's not internal but an external wound. Nishalim b'boki b'chola, right? Because this is in contrast to the Shulchan Aruch that we're going to see soon. That's an internal wound, which obviously back in the day they knew very little about. Now we have MRIs, we have CAT scans, we have ways to see what's going on inside. Back then they did not, but a non-internal wound, so an external wound, you would ask a bakir acholev ve'ein mechalon mishabes ad shomer echa mehem shu tzarich l'chol. And you would not be Mechal Shabbos until one of them would say that you need to be Mechal Shabbos, or one of them would say this is a case of Sakanas Nefashos. But then Mishnah Berurah amends that in a very important way. He's not arguing, he's just explaining the Shulchan Aruch, and it's clear that he's just explaining the Shulchan Aruch, because otherwise the last line would be redundant. Mishnah Berurah adds, Sarach lomar safek sakanos nefashos. If even one person, if one of these Bekiyim think it might be a case of Sakanas Nefashos, then that would also be a reason to violate Shabbos. It's possible that this could lead to pikuach nefesh circumstances, v'yistakin, and then he'll be in danger, nami shari. So therefore, it's still mutter to violate Shabbos. So what does it mean? So what does it mean though to violate Shabbos? And this really comes from Mishnah in Yuma of Hakoshish Begrono Matilim Lo Sam B'Sel Piv, that one who has a choshish begrono, which is much more than just a cough or something, one who has an ailment in his throat, you would put medicine to the mouth of their person on Shabbos, because in that case it's a case of safek nefashos. But kol safek nefashos dochas Shabbos, and Mishnah Yuma says all safek nefashos also is dochas Shabbos. Ooh, am I still on the Zoom? My Zoom just.
Yeah, you're still good.
Okay, I'm still good. Thank you. So, and all safek nefashos also is dochas Shabbos. So even if it's a suffix. So now we get to an important question, which again, we're not going to delve into fully, but it's an absolutely essential point. That what does it mean that we know pikuach nefesh is dochas Shabbos? So someone's drowning, or someone is having a heart attack, or someone is having a stroke, and an easy case, and you're on Hatzalah, let's say. You know that you violate Shabbos, you do whatever you can to save their life. But what does it mean a suffix? What does it mean a doubt that someone's in danger? Because I gave a good case before of someone falling down the stairs, a really bad fall, and let's up the ante. An elderly person who has a bad fall on their head and they might have a brain hemorrhage. That's a suffix. You're not sure what's the deal. It could be they just got a bruise, but it could be an internal wound. It could be something that definitely needs immediate attention. But what about any other case? You have people who often might say anything could be. I have a cold, but it's possible that, and I feel like I'm coughing a little bit, but maybe it's some rare lung disease. You could hear someone thinking that, especially med students around here. I've definitely heard svaras like that when people are in the middle of their learning, which is great. But so what does that really mean? Suffix. Suffix is a massive topic. What does it mean? A doubt. Anything could be a suffix. So the Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach says something that I think is intuitive, but it's important to lay out explicitly Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach and Minchas Shlomo, Chelek Beis, Siv Gimel, and then within that, Lamed Zayin, he says, the Rosh Shlomo Zalman says something interesting. I won't read it all in Hebrew. I'll translate, because he basically says, for this concept of ma nikra safek pikuach nefesh and ma lo, for the concept of what's called a safek pikuach nefesh and what's not, about eifo hu agvul, and where the boundary actually is of a safek, I just think this is a great line. I'm also not 100% sure, says Rosh Shlomo Zalman, so we're in good company. But it seems, he says, something that logically, in any case where most people would flee from this, where most people would think this is a case of sakana on a regular Tuesday, then it's considered a case of safek nefesh. In those cases are v'chai behem below shiyamas behem. So a case where someone has, we're going to get into a regular headache, which might not even be a chol she'ein bo sakana, might only be a michush ba'alma, and it doesn't matter if you don't know what that means right now. But they think it might lead to something greater. It's always possible, but something that normal people, and I guess it could be in your community, normal people in your community, that's generally how we go. How would someone approach this in a regular day on a Tuesday? Would they approach this as a case of pikuach nefesh? I think that's a good starting point to understand. So pikuach nefesh, but also safek pikuach nefesh, a case where it's possible, as the Mishnah Berurah pointed out, even a case of safek sakanas nefashos, we would say that you would violate Shabbos for that. But there's another point. So what do we know so far? We know that pikuach nefesh is docha Shabbos. So if someone's drowning, someone had a heart attack, someone had an aneurysm, or someone had anything else, and you're just not sure, and either you're not sure or you're sure that there's a case of pikuach nefesh, therefore you'll violate it. So, what's a case, for example, if someone's not breathing well, right? So someone who has a respiratory issue, like pneumonia, RSV, COVID, something like that, and they're debilitated to the point where they cannot breathe. Right? So it's pretty obviously fatal. That's pretty conclusive. So simply, what would you think? We would hook them up to a ventilator. That's the normal way that you would approach that, probably, or maybe a tracheotomy or something like that. And now they could breathe, right? So that's clear that you'd be able to, whatever you would go about in order to save this person, whatever the direct way of saving this person, that's what you would do. And that's obvious. V'chai behem, you could be machal Shabbos. But what's also important to lay down is that it seems like it's much more than that. That whatever is the standard, and this is an important klal to get, and this is why I really wanted to start with some of these introductory points, that whatever is the standard of care for that type of illness, including those things that may not directly save the lives themselves, that may not be directly life-saving, like hooking them up to the ventilator, or giving a tracheotomy or anything like that, something that won't be directly life-saving, those cases would also be included in something that you could violate Shabbos for, whatever the standard type of care for that illness. So let's give an example. So this person who has a respiratory illness and can't breathe, so after you hook them up to a ventilator, we would still do other actions that you would normally do, like maybe you would take their blood pressure. Now, the person's heart is not really where it's at, right? But nevertheless, although it's not directly life-saving, and again, you might think, oh, v'chai behem means I could only violate Shabbos for what is saving them. Nevertheless, we would say, especially because in this case, since the heart is not really where the problem is, again, obviously, everyone here is smart. You could figure out a case where probably the heart would be relevant, but although it doesn't seem directly to be the ikr life-saving of this person, whatever you would be doing in a hospital, whatever you would be doing to care for this patient, we'd still do that, because this is how we treat someone in the ICU, for example. We'd be able to do that. And how do we know that? It seems to come from the next source in the Shulchan Aruch, who's really, I didn't give all the background of the Rishonim, who's really quoting basically verbatim the Ramban in Torah Sa'adim, who's really quoting Ramban, but he says an important point. And second to last source on the first page, Maka shel chola, an internal wound, eina tzricha omed. You don't even have to do an evaluation if something's internal, which again, we, at least back then, and for sure for normal people now, we're in the same boat, that if someone has this big fall, and it could be an internal wound, even if there are no bikiyim, and the chola doesn't say anything, because it is a concept in halacha that if the chola says something, the chola speaks up and says, and this is another important point, if a chola speaks up and says, I need X, Y, and Z, it comes up in Yom Kippur, for example, that if someone says, if the person fasting says, I need to eat, but you bring them to a doctor and they say, oh, they could probably hold off for a few hours, we still listen to the person because we believe that someone knows about their own body, someone knows about their own illness. Again, we don't take that necessarily so far. If someone comes with stage 2 or stage 3 cancer and says, I need penicillin, then that won't necessarily be what we would do, because that's like not even in the realm of things that make sense. But we generally listen to people. So even if there are no doctors, and even if there are no professionals, and even if the person doesn't say anything, nevertheless, since it's an internal wound and it's possible, you would do what you would do on a Tuesday, because this person is in a case, again, this person's life is on the line. You would do what is normal to do with them on a Tuesday, on a weekday, but and that's what the Shulchan Aruch says, again, basically verbatim quoting the Ramban and Torah Adam. But the Ramban does backtrack a little bit. Right? So he backtracks a little bit and he says, but if we're fully aware, and I've dealt with this, and I'm a doctor, and I've dealt with this 1,000 times, and I know that it doesn't need Chil Shabbos. I know what this is, and I know this doesn't require whatever Chil Shabbos you're asking for. Even though it's an internal wound, again, if someone's absolutely positive that it doesn't need anything else, then of course you wouldn't be able to violate Shabbos for that. And the Mishnah Berurah solidifies that in the next source. And Mishnah Berurah says that he says about kol shebarer she'im b'minias osu davar chashash sakana. And again, this, from what the Mishnah Berurah says, we should infer what he's not saying. Anyone who is absolutely barer she'im b'minias osu davar chashash sakana, one who is absolutely clear to him that withholding treatment or a particular treatment is not dangerous whatsoever, afal pisha mikomakom tzarachulo, and we're going to get back to that. But even though it might normally be done in certain circumstances, if you absolutely know it doesn't help whatsoever, we wouldn't, and this is coming from some Gemaras and things we're not going to get too into, but you wouldn't light a bonfire for someone who you see on the temperature at 75 degrees there, and they're perfectly comfortable and everyone's fine. There wouldn't be a need to do that. And I know this won't help whatsoever. Therefore, you won't violate Shabbos for that. So there is limits to it if you absolutely know, even though we just said we act like we do on a Tuesday. And the Mechaber says that at the beginning of this halacha in Shimcha Ches Sif Dalid. If you're an expert and you've seen these things 1,000 times, then we won't do it. Good. And therefore that's how we go here. So again, B'chai Bahem is not just necessarily directly life-saving, but also you could take their blood pressure. You could do things that would be necessary, things that are important in terms of saving this particular individual. And this gets into a very important concept in halakha that, again, we're not going to get too deep into. Maybe we'll push a lot of I didn't put so many sources on the sheet about this because, but maybe we'll just give some of the background to an important concept called Hutra Duchuya. What does Hutra Duchuya mean? Is Shabbos, we know that Shabbos is, so just to backtrack, we know V'chai Behem, V'ashivos Salot, Pikuach Nefesh is Docha Shabbos, Safei Pikuach Nefesh is Docha Shabbos, the normal way we care for someone who's in danger, for someone whose life is on the line. That's what we're dealing with right now. Someone who's absolutely, someone who needs, or you think it's very possible, or what's normal to think that this person needs violation of Shabbos in order to treat them. Then you would violate Shabbos for them. But the question is, how do the mechanics of Pikuach Nefesh Docha Shabbos work? And this is important for everything that we're going to discuss. Does it work through Hutra or through Duchuya? When we have two things that oppose each other, when we have two concepts in halacha that oppose each other, so we have Shabbos, we have Pikuach Nefesh, and we know one wins out. We know that Pikuach Nefesh wins out. But how do the mechanics there work? There are two ways that we would say it. We would either say Hutra or Duchuya. What do those two things mean? You look at the words, Hutra means you have Shabbos and you have Pikuach Nefesh. But once we decide, once the halacha tells us, once the Gemaras that we saw, once the Shulchan Aruch, once the halacha decides that Pikuach Nefesh is Docha Shabbos, Shabbos is gone. Once we override Shabbos, Shabbos Ki'ilu, for this purpose, for the purpose not forever, but for the purpose of this situation, Shabbos no longer exists. Shabbos is completely gone, and there's not a concern whatsoever or a calculation when I'm involved in the midst of saving a life, because Shabbos is totally gone. It's no longer Shabbos. It's a Wednesday. Legamri. Completely, it's a Wednesday. Shabbos and that which was once usher is now completely hutra from the word mutter. Everything is mutter. Everything goes. Shabbos, you have pikuach nefesh, and Shabbos is gone, pikuach nefesh is there. That's one way of understanding the concept of pikuach nefesh being docha Shabbos is hutra. The other way of understanding it is dechuya. What does dechuya mean? It means that these two values still exist. Shabbos still exists, even though pikuach nefesh overrides it, but it's dechuya, it's pushed aside in certain circumstances, but Shabbos is still a value. It still exists. So it's still Shabbos, but I'm justified in this particular activity because this is allowed, because Pikuach Nefesh is Docha Shabbos, but Shabbos is still a calculation and it's still a concern. So Hutra is saying I value Shabbos, so perhaps another way of saying it is that Hutra is saying I value Shabbos, but I value Pikuach Nefesh even more, and therefore Shabbos is now gone, but Techuya is saying maybe that I value Pikuach Nefesh does override Shabbos, but Shabbos still exists, and Shabbos is still here. Shabbos is still very much in the cards. So these are the two ways in general of going about these halachic cheshbonos. Which one is it? Is it hutra or is it techuya? What's important, and maybe we're not gonna get into all the marmakomos about it, but it seems to be a machlokes Shulchan Aruch and Ramah whether this is actually, we're not going to give all the background, but maybe we'll just read it. When you are machal Shabbos on someone who's a cholish yeshbo sakana mishtadlin shelo lasos, and this is coming from a Gemara we're not going to get into. You should be mishtadlin. You should try your best. Shelo lasos ayidei akum. You should actually not do it through a non-Jew, uketanim v'nashim, or through children or women. Again, we're not getting into this. Yisrael gedolim ubnei das. You should do it through Yisrael gedolim and bnei das. You should do it perhaps through the biggest Talmidei Chachamim, or through people who know what they're talking about, and don't necessarily limit your Chil Shabbos. This comes to a big machlokas rishonim in the Gemara about how exactly we would understand that Gemara. Perhaps it was for pragmatic reasons, that the reason why you wouldn't let non-Jew do it is because maybe they wouldn't act with the same amount of expedience, or maybe if someone else sees, and we could get more into this, next time, maybe if someone else perceives that you're looking for a way out and you're not actually dealing with this patient yourself, you're not actually dealing with this person in trauma yourself, then they would think that actually Pikuach Nefesh is not Docha Shabbos. Perhaps they would get the wrong impression and think you're not allowed to save a Jewish life, even though there's a non-Jew readily available and able to do it for you. Maybe they'll get the wrong impression. These are different ways that the Rishonim deal with that Gemara. But the Ramah, which is an important, which we're going to read just for this point, is he says, "V'yesh omrim dim efshar lasas below dichoy, ubelow icher al yedei shinui." If it's possible to do this without dichoy and without ichor, without delay whatsoever, and we're able to do it in the exact same way, and it won't cause any pain whatsoever, and it won't cause any difference to the patient, then you should do it ayidei. You should do it by bumping it down to a derabanan, by being mishaneh, by not doing it in the normal way. And again, if you could do it through a non-Jew without delaying whatsoever, you should do it through a non-Jew. And says the Ramah, this is how we are noheg. But if you're nervous that and this is an important point that we're going to get back to in 1 second, but in the case where you're nervous that the non-Jew might delay and might not be as expedient as you are, specifically for cholish yeshbo sakana, ein lasos ayidei akum. Obviously, you should not use the akum. So it seems that there's a machlokes here between the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, whether it's hutra or dechuya. The Shulchan Aruch says there's no calculation whatsoever to try to find a non-Jew. You could violate even a doraisa in all these cases in order to save this person. And the Ramah also holds, by the way, of everything we said, that v'chai behem wins out, and that includes doraisas. Pikuach nefesh is docha Shabbos. But we would say dechuya. What does that mean? That Shabbos is still a calculation. Shabbos is not gone, and therefore, if things are all the same, and that's a big if it's all the same, then to this patient, and there is no indication that there would be any difference in this patient's outcome or in this patient's actual care. If you could find a non-Jew to do it, which would really be a derabanan, all amira la'akum is a derabanan, then we would say you should do that, says the Ramah. And we would go with the concept that we find in Yuma with Hakala Kal Tchila. We would go with the most lenient thing first. Again, you are allowed and you are mechuyev to violate Shabbos to save someone. But we would go with the concept of dechuya. Shabbos is still a calculation, and therefore you should have to think about a way to minimize your malacha in a practical sense. In a practical sense, and this is important to get into these cheshbonos and get into these thoughts for sure. When it comes to, for example, someone who's actually on a call and if someone's having a heart attack, or someone is, and let's say for a Hatzalah person, and someone's in a heart attack, to think about the concept of trying to do a shinoi, trying to find the guy is absolutely a problem. And that's why a lot of Mefarshim get very upset at this Ramah. The Taz and the Aruch HaShulchan and many, many others point out with this Ramah that it's going to lead to a problem. That if someone sees that where I'm going to try to pull shtick and I'm going to try to figure out a way, not pulling shtick, I'm going to try to figure out a way to minimize this malacha, then maybe it'll lead to a problem through their patient. Although the Ramah says very clearly that this is only in a case where it won't lead to any outcome whatsoever, people might be thinking in this way. So obviously, if you're in the middle of a surgery, or you're actually in the middle of caring for a patient directly, these are not concerns that we have. We take care of this patient who is a chola sheyesh bo sakana, a chola who is in danger. Obviously a Hatzalah guy could drive his truck, do what he has to do, go immediately. Every single second counts to think about it. The only time when this comes up, when this is thought, and that's why the concept of hakala kal tchila, or the concept of dechuya, doesn't come up in every situation, and that's why you're going to have to find a case. And hakala kal tchila, again, when both situations are readily available, and when it doesn't lead to any different outcome, then what we paskin is dechuya. What we say is that pikuach nefesh is docha Shabbos, but it's dechuya and not hutra. So what's a good example? Let's just give one example. We're not getting into driving, and I didn't want to give a driving example, but we'll give one driving example. Is I know that my patient's in a chola sheyesh bo sakana. My patient called. Let's say I don't have a scheduled shift. I don't have any of that, but I'm on call. My patient called and they're coming in to the hospital. And I live 10 minutes away from the hospital. And my patient I know lives a half hour away. So I know 100%, even if it says on my Uber, even if my Uber says that it'll be here in 15, I could get there in 15 minutes. I know I'm going to beat them. I know I'm going to beat my patient there. And there's absolutely no difference, clearly, if I would drive. And let's say in theory, although we get back to this, although it's not necessarily true that driving would take quicker at all. You have to deal with parking, whatever. Let's assume driving would take quicker in our scenario right now, and let's assume, and you're driving again, in theory, if a Hatzalah guy has not an electric truck, he has a Hummer, he's doing all these doraises every time he drives. Nevertheless, of course, he could drive. But in our situation, when someone, again, it's a chola sheyesh bo sakana, you got to go save them. But if you could do this concept of dechuya, you could find another way out. You could do it through amir la'akam, through another avenue. Then we would suggest that you absolutely should. And that's generally how we paskin. This is where there's a bit of a difference between Ashkenazim and Sfardim. It appears that again, I said it was machlokes Shulchan Aruch and Ramah, and maybe we'll give more background when we talk about other situations. But for this purpose, just for now, to talk about Hutra Dechuya, we'll leave it at that it seems to be Machlokes Shulchan Aruch Ramah. And although many of the even Ashkenazi poskim argue on the Ramah and say this is wrong, it seems that the modern day poskim, Rav Shlomo Zalman, is quoted in Shmir Shabbos and Nishmas Avram and all the other modern day poskim. I just discussed this with Rav Willig and many others, and all of the current svarim seem to say that we try to deal with dechuya, but again, to be cheshboning this and be thinking about this in the middle of dealing with a chola sheyesh bo sakana is something that we would not necessarily be doing, something that we would not be involving ourselves in, and we wouldn't be thinking about. Good. So that's what we would say about hutra and dechuya. And again, you could start thinking about cases where this would come up. And this is an important point. Again, just to bring back, just to put on the table that the concept of hutra and dechuya, and of course, that applies to everything we saw upstairs. And again, just to clarify, we would violate Shabbos for chola sheyesh bo sakana. Not necessarily. We're not going to get too deep into the other types of illnesses. Maybe we'll save that for next time. But chola sheyesh bo sakana, we would say absolutely we would do this. There are other types of illnesses that think about when we when we apply when we're trying to deal with a patient. And that's why everything that we just said above is all referring to a chol sheyesh bo sakana, and that's important. You know what? Maybe I'll just define these things, and then I'll say what we are. You know what? Actually, I'll leave it. Maybe we're not going to get into the 4 types of illness. I see it's late, and then next time we're going to pick up with halakha l'maisa topic. Perhaps we're going to confirm later, and we'll confirm on the group. But perhaps we're going to deal with driving next time, and Bez Hashem, and then we're going to get into some of these other types of illness, and we'll define them, and it's absolutely essential to do so. I'm sorry, maybe we'll just define them for now. Chol sheyesh bo sakana is someone who is in danger right now. Sakanas Aver is sort of in between that and chol sheyesh bo sakana. We'll leave that for now, but someone who's potentially going to lose a limb, which we understand is not just being a limb, but being any part of their body, maybe a pancreas or something else, not necessarily one of the 248 limbs. But really any part of their body, perhaps an eye or other things, and we'll bring more marmakomos for that. Chol she'ein bo sakana is another type of sickness, which is important because we don't violate doraisas for a chol she'ein bo sakana. We don't violate doraisas, at least for now. We would perhaps we would rely on other avenues, but we don't violate the rabbanos for chol she'ein bo sakana, and then but we would violate certain drabbanans, but not all drabbanans. You could do amira la'akum on a drabbanan for a chol she'ein bo sakana. You would also be able to we'll leave that for now. You'd be able to violate amir la'akum on a chol she'ein bo sakana on someone who is not in danger right now, which I'm sorry, we're going to define this later. I see that it's getting late, and we'll get back with all these things. We should okay. It was very nice to learn with everyone, and I'm open for questions that people could let me know through Avi or other things. I know we didn't get into all the practical things, but I just wanted to lay out some of the basic sources. And Mirza Shem, next time we're going to get into more practical discussions. Maybe the last few minutes we'll cut out because I don't want to get into the types of illnesses until we could actually